Well, we are thrilled to be here with you and thrilled to get to have this conversation. We are going to start with a little bit of a scenario that kind of goes into some of our daily concerns. And then we are going to lean very heavily on Aaron and his expertise in what AI and cybersecurity mean, not just for us here, but globally. Ready to go?
Ready. Let's do it.
All right.
I am worried that Jackie's not here because she was the smart one.
Nobody in the audience knew that. Just use big words. So we're going to start with a scenario where something is happening and we don't exactly know what. We're going to base this scenario in Southern California, where they are experiencing rolling blackouts across several counties. No one knows what's happening. People start to wonder. The news starts to infer that maybe this is an outside threat. But minutes are ticking by. Every minute feels like an hour. What happens in a moment like that on the ground all the way up to the top? Who's the decision maker? How do they get their information? And how do they react in a way that maintains calm and gathers information?
Sure, Ashley. Thanks for the question. And first of all, let me just say thank you to the Policy Circle for having me and for hosting this amazing event. It's wonderful here to speak with such a really interesting, outstanding group like this. The scenario we're going to talk about, you know, it's alarmingly real. Like, this is not the fun, happy panel. This is kind of the doom and gloom panel.
We'll try to end with a joke.
But we can laugh as we go. But look, I mean, just to start with something very broad before I answer your question directly. Mm-hmm. You know, I caught the end of the Cold War when I was very young. I don't remember that much of it. And you could argue that the nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union was pretty dangerous. But in 2025, I really do think we can say that the global situation, to include the threats that situation then poses to the homeland, is about as dangerous as it's been at least since 1989. And I think you can make a case that it's more dangerous than many moments during the Cold War. One, because of different geopolitical flashpoints that we're probably all familiar with. Don't need to go into them right now. But two, the way in which the homeland really is exposed. And I don't know that people appreciate that to the extent that they should. So this scenario, the power goes out somewhere. People are affected. What's going on? Well, so the first thing I would say, the way you framed it is, there's just some ambiguity about what's going on. I mean, sometimes the power just goes out, right? And there are local authorities, there are the utilities. Every state, you know, California will have its own processes for handling and responding and dealing with these things. It really only becomes a matter of national security concern when there is evidence or information to suggest that there's some kind of cyber actor at work here, which I guess is implied in the scenario, is that like somebody did this. In Washington, the responsibility for coordinating and initially managing things like this is an agency that lives within the Department of Homeland Security. It's a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, which for all sorts of obvious reasons has had a more and more prominent role in recent years. So the power goes out. No one really knows what's going on. In the short run, it's not that big of a deal, but you know, these things can become a very big deal in the long run. I mean, think about everything that electricity makes possible. At some point, you know, the hospital's backup generators only go for so long. Cloud computing facilities that are in the area obviously need power to perform. Like, there's all kinds of knock-on effects. And if it's limited, like you've just said in our scenario, you can probably mitigate a lot of it, and that would be the first thought, is how to mitigate this. But there are scenarios where you see widespread power outages, and at that point things get much harder to mitigate, and you start getting into the potential of real human costs. Like, people can die as a consequence of this stuff. We haven't really had something like this happen in the United States yet. We have had, and I'll let you continue to walk us through the scenario, but we have seen Chinese state efforts to prepare the ground for this sort of thing. There was a Chinese cyber operation that was revealed in 2024 called Volt Typhoon that essentially laid the groundwork to do just the kind of thing you're describing. I can say more about that, but I want us to keep going.
Yeah, no, I mean, to add to that, the extra layer, you get to a point where the blackouts are affecting more and more people. There's possible information that there is an outside source, but that is unconfirmed. We don't know who that outside source is. Again, when do we get to the top decision makers? Who is the top decision maker, and how are people on the ground best able to assess and provide useful information?
Yeah, so in terms of the decision makers, I mean, the top level decision makers, like the nation's national security apparatus, really comes into play once there is information to the effect that this is some sort of malicious actor, especially a foreign actor, and that the thing is happening at scale. We have, tens, hundreds of thousands, whatever, millions of Americans affected. I mean, at that point, it becomes an issue for the National Security Council and the Homeland Security Council. I mean, there are officers at the White House, right, who deal with this sort of stuff. And if you have information indicating that, let's say, a state actor like China has just turned off the lights in some part of America, or at the very least that's a possibility you have to take seriously. At that point, that is a National Security Council matter, and the president becomes the most important decision maker. And if you are at that level and you're advising this process, ultimately, if you're advising the president, I think you already pointed to one thing you're thinking about, which is who. Like who is doing this? And it may not be clear. Like a lot of this stuff can be pretty opaque. And then the other big question that's on your mind is why, right? Because the sort of thing that we're talking about hasn't really happened yet. My expectation is that if you are going to see cyber attacks on the homeland, they are going to be part of some broader strategic puzzle. They will be part of some purpose. And this is kind of where we start to get into this scary terrain. We're all aware that there are flashpoints out there in the world where things could escalate quickly. Let's say that something happens out in the Western Pacific over Taiwan. I promise you, if American forces and Chinese forces come into conflict in the Western Pacific, we will immediately start to see events in the homeland that are a broader part of Chinese strategy. And they may not just be power outages to sort of disrupt life and mess with people's lives and cause harm in that way. It may be that the Chinese, for example, know that in scenarios that are playing out in the Western Pacific, we're going to be moving forces and assets out of the United States to that part of the world. Well, what if you could shut the power off in the places where they need to be moving through? What if you can mess with the rail networks? What if you can mess with the ports? All of our ports are containerized now. What if you can shut off the equipment that moves the containers to the ships, right? These are all things that are possible with cyber. So if I'm sitting in the National Security Council and we have something that, as you've described it, is sort of ambiguous, it's not totally clear what's going on, we don't really have hard evidence of who's done it, but then why? That's really what's on my mind.
So I guess that leads me into my next question, which is more AI focused. When it comes to the idea that artificial intelligence is able to act in a way to garner information and process it quicker than us, and we're looking at a scenario where the power might be going down, but we're not super worried about it, or something, you're obviously the expert, something that seems very small. How are we able to, from a national security perspective, assess what is a blip in the radar, a normal hiccup, versus testing the fence?
Yeah, sort of a probing attack kind of a thing. Well, the problem is, unless your own signals intelligence capabilities or intelligence capabilities are picking this up, where the bad guys live, you may not know, and you may have to operate in this zone of ambiguity. I'm glad you raised AI, and it's something that we should explore. One, because it's the theme of the conference, but two, because it's really relevant. It's revolutionizing everything that we're talking about. It's revolutionizing the national security world, just like it's revolutionizing all of our daily lives. And one of the ways in which it's relevant in the sort of cybersecurity, cyber war context, and one of the ways in which it contributes to the way in which the world is just extremely dangerous right now, is just like you have new domains of competition and warfare like cyber. Within those domains, these new technologies like AI, they just make everything faster and more efficient. AI is really, really good, right, at processing large amounts of data determining patterns and then leveraging those patterns to perform tasks, right? Well, this is very useful if you want to set yourself up for a cyber attack. The plot that was revealed in 2024 essentially involved the Chinese security services, the MSS, their CIA managing it, infiltrating a series of infrastructure systems across the United States. Power and water were two of the big ones. And what they were doing was that it's called a persistent threat. They were essentially gaining access to networks, not really to do anything yet, but so that they could observe and gather information about how those networks work. And one day, should it be to their strategic advantage, should they decide that they want to do it, they were in a position within those networks to cause real harm, to turn stuff off, to cause equipment to perform in ways that would damage it, right? Potentially like really catastrophic harm. This is an extremely malicious act. One of my concerns actually is we haven't done a great deal as a country to respond to this specific incident or other comparable incidents. And it's not clear to me at all that we've established any kind of deterrence about it. In effect, what the Chinese did was, virtually speaking, come to our country and tie sacks. I'm quoting a colleague of mine, Mark Montgomery, who's very smart on this stuff. Tie sacks of 100 pounds of TNT to our power lines and power stations and water treatment plants and just walk away and leave them there. That's what the Chinese did. We haven't really responded besides a couple of indictments and limited sanctions. AI makes the whole process more efficient. It makes it easier to scan potential points of entry into a network, determine what's vulnerable, roll the dice, see if it works, right? If you can sort of have AI agents doing this rather than individual human actors, that's obviously faster. It's also the case that cyber attacks, for as much as there's often sort of fancy whiz-bang backdoor ways into networks, the easiest way to get into networks has always been, and as best as I can tell will always be, through the front door, through getting somebody essentially to make a mistake and let you in. And AI makes phishing a lot easier, both potentially to do it more realistically through voice simulation, right, and mimicking communications from trusted parties, but also to do it at scale. You text 1,000 relevant people and just see who bites, right? And each one of those outreaches, the AI agent can be simulating in real time an actual human being. So everything's faster, everything's more efficient. It also helps on the countermeasure side, but it's a bit of a cat and mouse thing, where the countermeasures and the offensive measures are always sort of evolving with each other.
Well, let's, not that we don't love the doom and gloom. Let's kind of, yeah, I mean, it's your life, right? Let's talk a little bit more about that. If you could, talk about the ways AI on our side can help defend us, prep us, and then if you could also touch on the role of the private sector, because we increasingly see that while there is certainly a role for the government in managing this, there is also a role for coordination and cooperation between the private sector, which can often innovate much quicker than the government.
Two big questions. Let me take the first one first. It's revolutionary. It's absolutely revolutionary in the security context in ways which I think are mostly morally neutral. Like, you can shake your fist at it and say, I don't like this. It's a little bit like shaking your fist at gunpowder. Like, it's just here. It's a factor of the battlefield. Everyone is innovating, trying to get a competitive edge, and that's just the game, and you have to do it. There are other ways, which I'll get to, and which I think is slightly more concerning, especially when it comes to integration of AI into decision making. I'll talk about that in a second. What are some examples of how it's revolutionary? Missile defense. Twice in 2024, and then this year during the 12-day war between Israel and Iran on a regular basis, Israel was attacked by waves of Iranian weapons, mostly ballistic missiles, but also drones. Those two 2024 attacks are useful to think about because they're sort of discrete in time. Over the course of a couple of hours in each case, Iran launches essentially hundreds of assets. And all these assets, they travel at different speeds. They're sort of timed if they're doing their job well, which the Iranians is a bit of a mixed bag, but they're sort of timed to arrive at different targets at the same time, even though they're traveling at different speeds. And it's hundreds of things you have to think about. And some of them, if they land, like if they hit your nuclear power plant, for example, or they score a direct hit on a leadership asset or something like that, can have really catastrophic strategic effects. And it's all going to happen over the course of minutes. really. I mean, minutes to low number of hours. It's very different from aerial attacks of the past. Like if you think about like the Battle of Britain, we've all seen, the movies where the British, radar operators are sort of moving the squadrons around the big table as the German Luftwaffe comes into attack. Well, that's an attack that's playing out over hours and hours with propeller planes traveling relatively slowly. This is just happening very, very quickly, and you have to decide how to match which interceptor assets you have to the appropriate target. You also have to suss out from the trajectories of the targets, which, by the way, that's complicated too, what their objectives are, and make decisions. And this is where AI is really, really helpful. It can just do this at a much faster pace than any human mind can. Really, we've already, I mean, this is now just a fact, we've moved into a space where some of this stuff is happening so quickly you really can't compete without the AI. The AI just does things that the human mind was never really designed to do and can't do at pace. And that's where it's sort of like gunpowder. It's like we can shake our fist at these sorts of applications, but it's just the world as it is. The way in which I think AI in the security space is more concerning, frankly, tracks on with ways I think AI is concerning in the educational space. And it's where we start to outsource our thinking to the AI. Not sort of our applied tactical or operational, in the moment execution, but our strategic thinking. I had a really alarming conversation. I used to teach at the Naval Academy in the English department. I had a really alarming conversation with a former colleague of mine there who told me that he's going to, that the English department, is now going to have students use AI in the composition of their papers at the Naval Academy. To which I immediately responded, well, that's convenient because they can use the AI to write the papers, and then you guys can use the AI to grade the papers, and then everyone can just go to the bar early. It's like, more seriously, I think I may have misunderstood what we were doing when we were having students write papers. I didn't think that they were supposed to write the best possible paper, because if that was our goal, we were failing. It was not going well.
Yeah, AI doesn't do well at writing papers.
Well, yeah. But the goal, of course, was to give the students opportunities to think, right? And then critique their thinking and help them become better and clearer expressors of their ideas. And I think there's real truth to the notion that if you can't write it, you can't think it. Well, this concern I have about sort of undergraduate education, high school education being swallowed by AI in ways that really will rob us of our ability to reason. I see a lot now. I feel like every time I open up, the trade press or even the newspaper, I'll see some general officer saying, yeah, we're integrating AI into our planning processes, and I've become, very intimate with, chat, or the sort of approved DoD LLMs and stuff like that. I think that's really scary. I think that just like thinking is this core human activity, and when you're thinking about complicated things, this is a human activity that's central to our freedom and our ability to be human. Similarly, in the security space, strategy, it's not something that you know, it's something that you do. And all of us know that, whether it's in business or domestic lives, we all know how to match resources to challenges and think iteratively in time about what the other guy is going to do, and reason about whether it's to my advantage to take action now, or give it a couple hours, or maybe even a couple of months, and see if circumstances change. Like those things that I'm describing, that's strategy, and it's the most sacred responsibility of our commanders and ultimately the commander-in-chief. And I do worry about a world in which the Department of Defense and our security agencies sort of start to outsource this stuff to the LLMs. I don't really understand how that's going to work. And I think an earlier panelist offered some advice on AI in a different walk of life, that we just need to pause. I think this is the space where we need to pause.
Okay, well, let's go back to the original scenario we started with, where we have something happening, information is unclear, there may or may not be a hostile actor involved, but we are in a position where a decision needs to be made, and it needs to be made quickly. AI is obviously not the decision maker, but can be helpful in that. It would certainly make a quicker decision. How do we balance making a quick decision when minutes count with making a good decision and analyzing what few decisions are there and the consequences at hand? Yeah,
so here's where I think I have some bad news about how our government and because it's all been good news up till now.
I was gonna say, I'm like, but it was so light.
Thank you for pointing that out. I do worry that I know for a fact in the last administration it was the case. I think the current team is giving these issues serious thought, but I'm not sure we're there yet. I don't think we have a clear doctrine of response to this kind of stuff, the kind of scenario you're describing. I mean, there's a bunch of things that have to happen really relatively quickly. Some of them are straightforward. Obviously, you're going to be mitigating the effects of whatever's happened, trying to turn stuff back on, trying to get stuff working again. That could potentially get very messy, by the way, depending on the nature of the attack. And things may take time. And one takeaway for everyone is frankly not a policy takeaway, but a personal takeaway is we may all need to think about a world in which suddenly things are going to get a lot harder at our individual and family levels and develop some resilience at that level. I don't want to turn everyone into a prepper per se, but you may want to give it a little bit of thought. But back at the policy level, you know, we had, like I said, the response to Volt and then Salt, these two big Chinese cyber intrusions that occurred that were revealed in 2024. We basically indicted a couple people. We've offered some sanctions. There was a really spectacular case about a decade ago where, you guys may remember this, there was this sort of silly movie, The Interview.
Yes.
That Sony Pictures released.
Sony got in a lot of trouble for that.
I'll say. The government of North Korea, which is one of the most reckless cyber actors in the world, by the way, almost all to make a buck. The North Korean, you know, state budget is basic. It's something like half of the revenue is from essentially criminal activity. And they use cyber to rob people. I mean, and so Sony was going to come out with this movie making fun of the North Korean leader. The North Koreans basically said, you can't do this or else. Sony kind of waffled, but seemed like it was going to proceed, and it got just schwacked. I mean, the North Koreans, basically, long story short, shut down Sony's computers. A lot of data was lost. Theaters pulled down the movie out of fear that they were going to get attacked. The whole thing was very complicated. You know, estimates, the company lost something like $100 million in revenue. Nobody was hurt. But
I will say, to be rebellious, I streamed it as soon as I could.
That was the patriotic and American thing to do. What did we do? You know, we indicted a couple of North Koreans. Like, I don't think extradition is going to be forthcoming from Pyongyang anytime soon. We sanctioned a couple of people. You hear rumors, you know, we responded, we responded in ways that you may not know about. I'm not so sure about that. And I don't think we have a clear national notion of where our red lines are. Because in the power outage scenario with which you began, unlike the Sony real-world scenario that we have in our past, I mean, people could die. So what happens one day when there's an attack on the homeland, and let's say it's air traffic control, and in addition to inconvenience and economic loss, there's a plane crash? What do we do about that? What is our response? Do we just treat it as an act of war and now we're at war? Do we decide to respond in the cyber, domain? If so, do we say that we did it? You know, like you attacked us with cyber, now we're attacking you with cyber. It's us, don't do it again. I think you could make a case for that because I don't think there's any deterrence right now. I think if you look at the way we responded to the Sony hack, to Volt Typhoon, and then to this other one we haven't really talked about yet called Salt Typhoon, I don't think anybody's scared of us. I don't think anybody's scared of our cyber capabilities to the extent that they're going to be deterred from making mischief themselves.
I guess that leads me back to this idea of the private sector and the potential role there, the potential collaboration. How can we create this concept of readiness, not just personally and not just on a local level and a state level, but where are the areas where the private sector can kind of come in and help fill that gap?
So here is actually some good news. I mean, there have been some really positive developments with firms that in the national defense space, but also the tech space, firms like Palantir and Anduril, coming to prominence over the course of the last decade or so in an unambiguously patriotic, pro-American way. They're here to serve the U.S. government and its national security needs, and frankly, the West, what we would, once, and for bringing it back, have called the free world. That wasn't really if you go back, 15, 20 years, the attitude of Silicon Valley and at some of these firms even today was hardly patriotic, like this sort of Silicon Valley world where all these innovations are stemming from. I mean, all this stuff basically, as of right now, is an American-led, an American-driven dynamic out of that sector of our economy. They seem to live in a world all of their own. You would see, even recently, I mean, you see, when these companies are selling products to the U.S. Department of Defense, or God forbid, an ally like Israel, you'll see employees revolting and causing trouble. I do detect new seriousness and new resolve, probably partially as a function just of the world getting more dangerous and people waking up to that fact. But our government in this space, as in so many, is a bit moribund and hidebound and not quick to innovate. These companies definitionally are very quick to innovate and drive innovation. I think the more places where we can partner and work with Silicon Valley firms, the better. And for years now, we've been taking that seriously. I will say, again, just to add a note of caution, when it comes to, it is the LLMs that bother me the most. It is, I think, the space where I think we run the most danger of starting to get used to ways of planning and making decisions that are going to make us weaker. We should always remember that the AI companies themselves, who are sort of always in the tradition of like Silicon Valley firms, they have these visionary founders that are evangelical and talking about how they're going to change the world and it's all going to be great if we just buy their product. Remember, at the end of the day, these are incredibly talented, incredibly successful people. They are software salesmen, and it is in their interest that we buy and use the software all the time. And I do think, again, this is a place where it's okay to pause once in a while and ask ourselves, do I really want to, just as we're having the students, outsource the training of their thinking to the chatbot, which is to say they're never going to think. Like, it's actually, I think, a real problem. Do we want to start outsourcing our military planning to the LLMs? I think the answer is no, by the way, just to cut to my answer. Planning kind of like...
Playing devil's advocate, what would be the benefit of that?
Well, the average, human beings are human beings. So some of them are good planners, some of them are bad planners. I think you could expect the LLM to always be like kind of average, because it's definitionally, it's the aggregate of everything that you feed into it. So you could do it now. You can run the LLMs through the sort of standard DoD planning process, and it will spit out plausible scenarios and courses of action that you can then integrate into your own work. So there's a certain sort of bog standard of quality that you're going to get reliably using the LLM, and of course it's faster. It's faster, and to make the case for it, you can use it to check your own thinking. You can use it to sort of jog your memory about things that you might not otherwise have thought of. That's sort of the benign understanding of it. I worry, though, at what point you just outsource more and more and more to it, and it starts really being in the driver's seat and not the human. And the other is a famous Dwight Eisenhower line that in the military context, plans are worthless, but the act of planning is invaluable. That's because the plan is great, but there's going to be an enemy, and the enemy's going to do things, and in the moment you're going to have to iterate, and that's the sort of, again, the sacred task of the commander. The planning process is, in a way, an educational, so this is getting a little weedsy, sorry about that, but the planning process is an educational process where commanders and their staffs are learning about the battlefield they're potentially going to be operating in, such that in the moment when everything has to go out the window and you have to make a decision, the planning process has actually helped you establish your understanding of that battlefield. If the LLM was the one to understand the battlefield for you in the first place, are you better or worse prepared to iterate in that moment when the real war starts? I mean, I think I know the answer to that question. The answer is no. But this train is like, this is like a bit of a runaway train right now. Like, the thing that I am criticizing is happening.
That was uplifting. I appreciate that. So I guess it kind of, just to sort of wrap it up, because we discussed a lot of things across a wide variety, from local to national, the roles that are played by everyone, to international threats and historical actions. I guess for all of us in the room, those of us who are interested in this topic, those of us who aren't interested but suddenly are like, oh my gosh, maybe I should be, those of us from an educational standpoint, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, who are, terrified parents trying to figure out ChatGPT and how that writes our kids' essays. What do you have for us as far as resources where we can kind of get an idea, an overview of what's going on? What are the highlights for us that we need to consider, especially if we're engaged in talking with, local officials and things? Where do we get those, little nuggets, other than your podcast, obviously?
Yes, of course, School of War podcast. But we do cover this. No, I mean, my colleagues at Hudson do excellent work. There's one person in particular at a different think tank where I'm an advisor that I made reference to earlier, Mark Montgomery, who's a retired admiral who runs the Cyber Center at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. I highly recommend him and his work. He's outstanding. His team puts out really interesting stuff for those who are interested in learning more about this. I mean, I would say, one, at the policy level, I realize some of this stuff gets kind of technical and seems a bit sci-fi, but the future is really now. Like, this stuff is happening on the battlefield. A lot of what Israel was able to do over the course of its now 2-year-long war with the Iran axis that it was facing was enabled by AI. You guys probably remember, it was June the 1st of this year, the Ukrainians launched, we haven't really talked about drones, just to add another element of the conversation. The Ukrainians launched a very clever wave of drone attacks across Russia, and I mean across Russia, from like Murmansk out to the Pacific coast, and they loaded these small drones, they're basically flying bombs, into shipping containers, or box trucks really, that they then parked near the Russian airfields. The roofs popped off, the drones flew out and blew up something, damaged or destroyed something like 1/3 of the Russian strategic Air Force.
Yeah, the Air Force.
So these are the bombers capable of dropping nuclear weapons on us. It was enormous.
You just had to tie it back to us.
Well, the Russians certainly were. But there was an AI dimension to this as well. You can't expect that these drones, they're so far away, and also you're operating in different spaces where there might be jamming. So basically, if you're going to do something like this, and it's been reported that this was the case, you're going to want these drones to have a degree of autonomy to pursue their mission and select targets in the moment, because also you're not necessarily going to know exactly you can't just preload a picture necessarily and expect all the planes are going to be where the picture said they were. You have to, the technology exists today such that the drone can make decisions, and reportedly this actually happened in the attack. And I suggested to somebody who's really deep in this stuff, I said, well, that's fine, but wouldn't you have wanted to have a human controlling it if it was possible? And she said to me, actually, no, the AI is just better at it now. You would actually outsource it to the AI no matter what in these autonomous situations. So you may not be interested in these subjects, but the nature of war is this old Leninist line: you may not be interested in the war, but the war is interested in you. Like, this stuff is here, it's now. The world is a fragile place, and so at a policy level, this stuff is alarmingly relevant and important. At the personal level, I just make the point that we've had a lot of, the Cold War was a pretty bloody time depending on where you were in the world, and there's a lot of Americans fighting in places like Vietnam and Korea, and then obviously we've had our post-9/11 wars. We've not had a direct great power conflict since 1945 for a whole variety of reasons. It feels in 2025 like we are closer to that, certainly since at any time other than the Cold War or since the Cold War. And if that were to happen, even a non-nuclear conflict, I think the homeland is extremely exposed, and we should all think about ways that we individually and personally can be resilient, and we should absolutely be encouraging our local communities to have, many of them do, but to take the planning process for local resilience seriously, because it is not sci-fi. It's very possible.
Okay. On that note, I would like to
Happy Thursday.
It's Friday Eve. It's the perfect time for this conversation. I actually think that's great advice locally. Local is a big part of the policy circle and what we do, and to go to those local leaders and make sure, should something like the scenario we started with happen, we have already presented them with the encouragement to be prepared for that. And I also encourage all of you who are circle leaders or want to be circle leaders, because you should all want to be circle leaders, to really look at several of our policy briefs, including the one on the armed forces. This is a huge topic for us here because AI is something that is kind of everywhere all at once. And to look for more resources like the one suggested and also ready.gov. So if you have more questions, if you have more interest, I just really, really encourage you to look at the briefs and all the information that has been put together really quite spectacularly. And with that, I'm out of time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.